Well, over 20 years have passed since NASA's James Hansen first testified to Congress that the global temperatures had risen beyond the range of natural variability. 20 years, so that would make it 1988. And it seems to me the first attention on global warming really happened starting in 88, 89. Well, waiting another 20 years before we take decisive action, and by that I mean not a little bit here and a little bit there, but action that actually is equal to the challenge is not an option. Hansen's latest research indicates that greenhouse gas concentrations have already reached damaging levels. The climate is nearing a dangerous tipping point, a term that didn't even exist when he made that first statement. A dangerous tipping point that will unleash far-reaching changes in the atmosphere and oceans that could take millennia to reverse. In his latest paper, he calls for deep reductions in carbon dioxide emissions beginning almost immediately, with a focus on phasing out the uncontrolled combustion of coal by 2030, 21 years from now. Although many still argue that a transition to a low-carbon energy system will be enormously expensive and difficult, research at Worldwatch Institute has shown that on the other side, it could open up vast economic opportunities, spur innovation, job creation, assist efforts to reduce poverty, and increase energy security. Now, this information is more important than ever as we face a national and a global financial crisis. And today I'll be speaking with Worldwatch President Christopher FLAVIN, and I will talk about how our current energy and climate policies are broken, how and why they got that way, and most importantly, how we fix them and turn things around. Christopher FLAVIN is president of the Worldwatch Institute, a Washington-based international research organization focused on energy, resource, and environmental issues. He's the co-author of 3 books on energy, including Power Surge, Guide to the Coming Energy Revolution, which anticipated many of the changes now underway in world energy markets. He's also a regular co-author of the Institute's annual State of the World report, which has been published in 36 languages. He's participated in several of the historic international conferences, including the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 92 and the Climate Change Conference in Kyoto, Japan in 1997. Welcome again, Christopher FLAVIN.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Very good. I noticed as I listened to myself in that intro, I pronounced your last name differently 2 different times. Which one should I say from now on?
FLAVIN.
FLAVIN, good. I got it right the last time. Thank you very much, Chris. Now, for those to whom it's new, what is the Worldwatch Institute? And the website for that, by the way, is worldwatchinstitute.org or just worldwatch.org?
Worldwatch.org.
Okay, worldwatch, one word, .org. What is it?
We're an environmental think tank, and our focus is international environmental issues, particularly the big global issues like climate change and the health of the oceans, the health of the world's forests. And we particularly focus on the intersection between the human economy and the natural environment and how we create a sustainable global economy.
Okay, and am I allowed to, I know I'm 3 hours ahead of the embargo, am I allowed to break the embargo?
You can certainly mention the book. If reporters cannot write stories and appear before 6 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay. Well, State of the World 2009, that is every year, Worldwatch Institute, for how many years has been coming out with this?
Since 1984.
Okay, since 84. Now, think about that, by the way. This is an organization that's been writing about the global environment since 1984, a point at which I have said when I've spoken to Lester Brown, one of the founders of Worldwatch, that was a time when the environment, I think, to people was a polluting factory nearby or a polluted river or a polluted lake, and that the concerns of the environment at that point, it seemed, were very local, and that the foresight and the big picture thinking that goes into a group that in 1984 began putting out an annual State of the World, I applaud. So State of the World 2009 will be released today. Can you talk briefly about the history of that report and how you focus this year on the subtitle of the State of the World report is Into a Warming World?
Well, the purpose of State of the World is to each year provide an assessment of the health of the global environment, both the natural world but also the human health that connects to that. And in recent years, we've tended to have a specific thematic focus each year. A few years ago, it was China and India. Then it was cities. Last year it was innovation. And this year, for the first time, we focused on climate change as the theme. Climate change is something we've dealt with, certainly in almost every volume since it was published. But this year, for the first time, we focused just on climate change. And we've done that in part because of the extraordinary urgency of the problem, according to all of the latest scientific findings. But also, this is the really critical and indeed historic year of Copenhagen, where the world is going to work to put in place an effective new successor agreement to the Kyoto Protocol that's supposed to happen late this year. And, of course, the sort of dramatic nature of this moment is heightened by the fact that we have a new U.S. president coming into office next week who has a very, very different focus on climate than his predecessor has had.
That's right. I was surprised, by the way, in what you just said, that this was the first annual report devoted to climate change. When I saw it, I went, oh, again? It was just the assumption because the issue has been so big for so long as a global issue. But what I asked you before we went on the air was whether we could approach the rest of this hour with basically three questions. And this is sort of the format I called It's Broke, Let's Fix It, in which I will, for the rest of the hour, basically focus on three questions. What's broken? How did it get broken, and how do we fix it? So on the what's broken, in terms of climate and energy, I realize this is more than one question because first there's the science or the natural phenomena, then there's the behavior, and then there's the policies. You follow me? So let's start with just the evidence that are dealing with climate and energy is broken, just on the natural level, the level of science.
There's been, just overwhelming evidence emerging in recent years that the climate is changing. I think most graphic is the loss of glacial ice in mountains and Antarctic ice. The ice over the Arctic Ocean is also melting, as well as the vast Greenland ice sheet. That's most graphic, but you also see it in the temperature measurements that are taken all over the world, which shows that we've seen a rise of 1.5 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit in global average temperature over the last century, most of it having taken place in the last few decades. But you also see it in the natural world, where there are particular species that have the capability to move, that are literally moving closer to the poles to be closer to the climate that they need for their own survival. And of course, all of this reflects the fact that we've got growing amounts of these greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and other gases in the atmosphere, that are having the effect that scientists have predicted for a long time of trapping heat and causing the climate to change.
Okay. And let me ask you a question. I noticed that when I read Skeptics, which I make a point to do, I interviewed Bjorn Lomborg at one point last year. But let me just ask, what is the correct thing we should be talking about here? Global warming or climate change? And let me just give you what my take has been, that it's more that it is greenhouse gas accumulation added to natural cycles that is producing this warming. But what we're really worried about is the climate change, the climate perturbations, the climate, the more radical, more alarming activity in the climate. And how do those two things fit together?
Well, I think you've described it well. Climate change, I think, is the more accurate scientific term. A lot of people use global warming as a synonym. I think there's some polling that suggests that maybe the public finds that term more alarming than the term climate change, which sounds sort of neutral, though I don't think that global warming necessarily reflects either the sort of dramatic and very dangerous nature of what we're doing. I sort of like the term that the Germans use. In German, they call it Klima with a K, catastrophe.
Oh.
And I think you can understand what climate catastrophe means. It's as if we were to call it a climate catastrophe rather than climate change. But those are all whatever word you choose. It's a vast simplification for an enormously complex, far-reaching process that literally could take centuries to reverse once it's occurred.
Now, I mentioned in the introduction, Chris FLAVIN, that the introduction I mentioned the work by James Hansen, and that he has said now 20 years after his first pronouncement on climate change, he has said that we are close to some tipping points from which there will be no return. Can you speak a little bit about, let's say, what the latest research tells us, especially about those tipping points? Because it seems to me this is the part that, if you look at climate change incrementally, this percentage of a degree warmer, this many feet loss, and so on, it seems like it's moving slowly. But there is something in here where nature feeds on its own activity at a certain point, and some of those tipping points are crucial, aren't they?
Exactly, and I think that's one of the most important developments in scientific thinking in recent years, that in fact it's not this sort of gradual process, but rather it's something that has the ability to speed up rather dramatically and to go over these so-called tipping points where things just start to get very different from anything that's been observed throughout the history of the human race, which, by the way, is only about 150,000 years old. Now, one of the ways I think you can most graphically understand this is that by drilling in ice cores, we're able to look at what the composition of the atmosphere has been like going back more than close to 1 million years. And what you find is that during that whole sweep of time, which is many times the total existence of the human race, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has never gone above 350 parts per million. Now, during that interval, you've seen there have been ice ages, there have been warm periods, there have been actually fairly significant changes in the climate, but the concentration has never been above that level, and we know from looking at past climates through these ice cores that in fact the carbon dioxide concentration correlates with temperature. Well, we're already over 380 parts per million and going up all of the time. And the last time the CO2 concentration was as high as it is today, the sea level rise was probably at least 5 feet higher and maybe as much as 10 feet higher than it is today. So we have really already gone to a point where we're really courting a disaster in terms of changing the climate in a way that the human species has never seen, and in which we, with our more than 7 billion people already on the planet, with our intense requirements in terms of
and our
water
growing
resources, agriculture, forestry, are just not in a position to deal with these major changes in the global ecology that could result.
Okay, let me just ask you, you mentioned that previously such a high concentration of carbon dioxide resulted in much more rise in sea level. Why not today? How do scientists explain that? Because I have a feeling that'll tell people, oh, well, then if that's off, who knows what's going to happen?
The reason is that we've only had these high CO2 concentrations a very short time, and it takes time for these effects to develop. And that's why what we're seeing in the Arctic is so critical, because there's, you asked for, what are the signs of going to a tipping point. Well, one of the things that's beginning to happen is that the melting of, for example, the ice over the Arctic Ocean is starting to accelerate. The Greenland ice sheet appears to be melting more rapidly. So we are now, in the process of beginning to experience the effects that you would expect to experience. And the notion of the tipping point, probably the best example is, if we don't have Arctic sea ice in the summertime, at that point that ocean will no longer have this ice reflecting sunlight back out into space, it will be absorbed as heat in the Arctic Ocean. That in turn will, for example, warm Greenland, which is very nearby. If the Greenland ice sheet were to melt entirely and all of that were to become liquid water, that alone would raise the global sea level by several feet. So that's the kind of thing that would allow climate change to begin feeding on itself.
And at that point, accelerating like crazy and being much less open to our repair, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Once it gets moving quickly in one direction, it's like a super tanker.
Sure.
It's difficult to get it moving, but now that we've got it moving, it's going to be very hard to stop.
Right. So a couple of things I heard there was that the warming that's already happening reduces ice. And it isn't just that the ice that was reduced and became sea matters. It's that the reflective quality of the ice versus the reflective quality of the sea that replaces it is another factor which now accelerates the heating, and it's those kinds of things that people, if they want to get sort of inside of this a little bit, can begin to think about, right?
Yeah, and exactly. One additional factor, though, the melting of Arctic sea ice actually will not raise sea level at all because that ice is already floating on the water. But if the melting of that ice causes the Greenland ice sheet to melt, and that ice is sitting on land, and then that falls into the sea, that will raise sea level, as will the melting of the Antarctic ice, which is also continental in nature.
Okay, very good. That's a distinction that I'd forgotten. So Arctic is ice on water. Mm-hmm. Antarctic and Greenland is ice on land.
Exactly.
So when that ice melts, that's the sea rise. One last thing before we leave the evidence of climate change. Another thing I think people should be aware of is, I'm going to read a statement from some of Worldwatch's work. Once greenhouse gas concentrations are stabilized, global mean temperature will continue to rise due to momentum in the climate system for several decades. And then half of the carbon dioxide emitted today is expected to remain in the atmosphere a century from now. So it's those. So we were talking about accelerating effects, but there are also these lag effects, right?
Exactly, and this is something that is totally different from the other environmental problems we've had to deal with. If you stop putting ozone and nitrous oxides into the atmosphere, within a few days the air will be clean. It'll get washed out of the atmosphere, whereas carbon dioxide stays there for a very, very long time. So that is the cumulative nature of what we're doing, and why the urgency to stop doing it is so great.
So let's move, Chris, to the second question then, or the second piece of that question, which is what's broken in terms of human behavior. And if you want to link that to policies, go right ahead. Or if we want to take policies as a next question, that's fine too.
Well, the largest single source of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is carbon dioxide that's released from burning fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are basically biological materials that were buried in the earth, in most cases many millions of years ago. So these living things contain carbon. You've got literally millions of years worth of them in the form of oil, coal, and natural gas. And what we've done is taken that huge reservoir of carbon and released a very significant fraction of it over a period of just a number of decades since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So that's added greatly to carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. In addition to that, we've done a lot of deforestation, cleared forests, and also caused the carbon in the soils below those forests to be released. We've also had agricultural practices that have caused unnecessarily large amounts of carbon to be released from soils. And then beyond that, there are a number of other gases, methane, nitrous oxide, and a number of fluorocarbons that are also very powerful greenhouse gases that are adding further to the problem.
Right. I'm sure you're familiar with the natural step, the organization out of Sweden, and I just remember that they had a very elegant way of looking all at this, and they basically said that up until very recent history, up basically until the beginning the use of fossil fuels, that the flows of things from under the ground into the atmosphere, back under the ground into the atmosphere through volcanoes or whatever, it was balanced, and that it's basically nature is, if you can use the word design, but nature's design is that those flows be balanced, and that what we've done for the last, I guess it's since 1860 or so, is knock them way out of balance, and what we're trying to do here is return some semblance of balance.
That's exactly right, and there is a natural, amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and there's a natural exchange between the atmosphere, the oceans, and the forests and other biological systems. But that is just massively out of whack now from what it naturally should be.
Right. And finally, the policies. What's broken in terms of the policies? What's the evidence that our policies are broken? And I'll allow you to look at that both globally and U.S.
Well, fundamentally, the fossil fuel-dependent energy system that we have today is at the root of a large part of the problem. And, that is something that we've obviously built up over a period of more than a century as we've developed new technologies, and we really wouldn't be where we are industrially unless we had all the cheap energy that was made possible by exploiting these very concentrated fossil fuels. And, of course, over time we've developed policies that encourage the development of that system. So we have subsidies, for example, to the oil industry. We have a way of regulating the electric power industry that encourages companies to build coal-fired power plants, a whole structure of things in place. But the biggest part of the problem now is that we've become very accustomed to certain systems, whether it be inefficient cars and buildings, or whether it be being dependent on these very carbon-intensive kinds of power generation. And it takes quite a bit of effort. It takes new policy, basically, to motivate the development of new technologies, new business practices, and even new modes of behavior.
Yeah, as I was listening to you, I was thinking, we talked about the feedback loops in the natural world, and of course there are feedback loops in the social world as well. In other words, if oil is in enormous demand and of enormous utility, which it has been, oil and coal, then the companies that do that, the industries that do that, become very wealthy, and then they use that wealth to influence policies, which allows them to continue to do exactly what they're doing, and so it's interesting just to me that how you see the same sorts of phenomena happening, and what you're saying is that that's going to happen. And so now it takes sort of an overriding vision and an overriding act of society to say, wait, we're breaking that loop. We're breaking that cycle.
That's exactly right. I think the encouraging thing is that there are indications where in specific sectors that loop is being broken. For example, there is a very rapidly growing and substantial scale of business activity in renewable energy sources like wind and solar energy. Some of the companies and some of the investment houses that are involved in that activity have become rather active in arguing for new energy policies and new climate policies. Now, at this point, they're massively outweighed by the status quo industries that are moving in the opposite direction. But there are, again, some encouraging signs that this sort of negative cycle is beginning to be replaced by one that's much more positive.
Okay. Any last comments on how we got here, either in terms of behavior, politics, policy, etc.?
Well, I think it's important to note that there is a significant part of the problem that's caused by the way we practice both forestry and agriculture. our soils continue to leach enormous amounts of carbon as a result of the agricultural practices that we have in place. If we had a different form of agriculture that was, for example, based more on perennial rather than annual crops, if we were doing adding less fertilizer and relying more on building up organic matter in the soils, we could actually turn large parts of our agricultural land from being sources of carbon dioxide being added to the atmosphere to actually being absorbers of carbon, taking it out of the atmosphere and contributing to solving the problem.
Why do we hear so little about that?
Well, I think in part because scientific understanding of it is really just emerging now. And I think you will be hearing a lot more about it. And also, we're beginning to develop the kinds of new agricultural techniques and even ability to measure carbon going into and coming out of soils, so that we may be able to provide some incentive systems to do the right thing.
Okay. In other words, and for people that just haven't followed agriculture, over the years, this basically there was a point at which agriculture, as you say, was natural or pretty close to natural, and as such the flows were pretty much in balance. And it was the introduction of fossil fuels into agriculture that really accelerated its turn into something which is damaging.
Well, I think the more important factor involved in agriculture is simply that, if you went back a couple hundred years, a large amounts of land that are now in agriculture were in forests.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of carbon in those trees and in the soil itself. And when we deforested a lot, for example, large parts of the Midwestern United States, that added a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. A process that's now being repeated in the Brazilian Amazon
right.
and other parts of the world.
So part of that is population, and then part of it is what goes under the name of development.
Exactly, and obviously we're not going to go back and plant trees on all of our grain land in the Midwest, but what we can do is to develop new cropping systems that will allow those soils to actually absorb carbon over time, which, by the way, will make them more fertile and then require less fertilizer to have decent crops.
Right. I interviewed Janine Benyus recently. I assume you're familiar with her work in biomimicry.
Right.
And, so much of this is that nature does things with the eye on the long term. That nature does things, and what we found was ways that we could accelerate or force nature to do things that it wasn't doing itself. And it's some of those things which were done, I would say, with the best of intentions, to be more productive, feed more people, et cetera, that we're now realizing the negatives. But the other thing that came up in that conversation is, and I think you sort of alluded to it before when you were saying that fossil fuels have allowed us to achieve a great deal, that the very instruments that we use now to see that there's a problem with climate change, to project into the future how that problem, those things would not have been developed had we not done this. So it's like now we have, we luckily, at the moment that we have this critical problem, we also have some of the knowledge, computer skills, computer capacity, and so on to actually heal it in a way we couldn't have in the past.
That's exactly right.
Okay, let's move to the third question. How do we fix it? And I will ask you, Chris Flavin, when I looked for an excerpt from the book to include in the email announcement that I send out each week telling people who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, I chose the 10 challenges that you and your co-author mentioned in Chapter 1. And then I was interested when I looked at your press materials to see you guys chose the same thing. So in this question of how do we fix things, I want you to position those 10 challenges either, as an introduction to that or within that or after that or whatever, but I think that's an important piece of it all.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the place to start is that we basically need to reinvent the energy system. We're going to need to figure out a way to get the energy we need for a modern society using a fraction of the fossil fuels. And I would say that's even true if we're successful in developing so-called carbon capture and sequestration technology, which would be basically a way of continuing to burn coal, for example, but putting the CO2 underground. I don't think you'll find even the most optimistic scientists thinking that we will ever be able to do that with the kind of quantities of carbon dioxide that we're emitting today, which is many billions of tons each year. We may be able to eventually sequester a small fraction of that, but the preponderance of what we need to do then is to basically reinvent the energy system. The fossil fuel-based energy system is really only about 150 years or so old, and of course we've got tremendous advances in technology that are available today, particularly in terms of using energy much more efficiently and also utilizing renewable resources that are not dependent on fossil fuels, things like solar, wind, and geothermal energy. And this is certainly not going to be an easy or inexpensive thing to do. It will take time and effort. I think the best analogy is the development, of the fossil fuel energy system to begin with. I mean, we went in just a few decades from the end of the 19th century, up through the first 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century, really built a totally different kind of energy system. And the fossil fuels had always been there, but they were not usable because technologies had not existed. So we invented, everything from, oil drilling technologies to refining systems to electric power generators that would burn the fuels to internal combustion engines, and that took what had been, essentially useless energy sources like crude oil and made them something effective. And we need to do the exact same thing with solar energy and wind power. One advantage we have is that those energy sources are actually much more abundant than the fossil fuels are. They're available in massive quantities, but they have some inconvenient qualities as well. I mean, they tend to only be available some of the time. They're more available in some parts of the world than others, though I might say that's certainly true of fossil fuels as well. But there are some major challenges in terms of how you store these energy sources and how you adapt them to the kind of modern economy that we have today.
So that's the big overall answer. Now, I believe that in the State of the World 2009 Into a Warming World, you spend a lot of the time looking at the solutions. And so what is some of the good news for this? What you're saying is that you're saying we got to do things with agriculture, we have to do things with population, we have to do things with, but that the biggest single thing is an entire reinvention of the global energy system. What are some of the good news, some of the things that are highlights that indicate the possibilities?
Well, there's been a tremendous advance in a whole host of these technologies, solar, wind, efficiency technologies. The Detroit Auto Show this week, you've got probably 10 different examples of electric and hybrid electric vehicles that are being developed by virtually every auto manufacturer on the planet. That all of that stuff is new, and it's being driven by policies in many cases, government incentives. It's also, we've got the sort of convenient fact that we've had this period of very high oil prices, which has now temporarily come to an end, but it's already motivated a tremendous amount of activity in terms of development of new technologies. But I think the thing that is really missing now is we basically do not have an overall system for either regulating carbon dioxide emissions or for putting a price on those emissions. And that's something that we need to do. The European Union already does have such a system in place. In effect, there is a price to be paid for emitting carbon dioxide in Europe, and that is a task that is now before the U.S. Congress and the Obama administration to begin putting a price on carbon and to provide the overall economic incentives that will allow us to accelerate this transition.
Now, it seems to me that this is not, how do I say this? This is not so much that you've got to, you can't say, here's what I meant to say. You can't say, well, forget the market. It doesn't work. It won't help us in this issue. I think what we know is that the pure market is a fiction. But the fact is, we have to come up with systems that don't work merely by fiat, but that actually harness people's natural inclinations. And so that's where what has long been externalized and the costs of fossil fuels, the costs of coal and oil did not show up. There's some way in which we begin to include those costs in the price of those substances so that the market will give us the right cues. What do they do in Europe? And what do they do in Europe? And what do you think will have to be changed about such a system to make it appeal in the United States?
Well, in Europe, the larger emitters of carbon dioxide, which are the big electric power companies, the chemical industry, the steel industry, those kinds of emitters of carbon dioxide have a cap on the amount of CO2 they can actually emit. And the system works such that a company really has two choices. They can either reduce their emissions to meet that cap, or they can go on doing some emitting but purchase what are called emission allowances from another emitter that is going beyond its legal requirement. So that creates a market that literally trades like the price of oil trades on a spot market for these emission allowances, and that has started to be a significant motivator in Europe for reduced emissions.
Okay, so this is what's normally called cap and trade.
Exactly.
And in the cases that work best, where do you place that cap? Do you place it on a national basis, on a European Union basis? In the U.S., would you place it on a national basis or on a state basis or a local basis? Where is it most effective to say this industry can do this? And that is what you say in this kind of situation, right? You don't say this company can do this. You say this industry can do this and then somehow work from there? Or I would love people to get some sort of understanding, because I have a feeling in the year 2009, we're going to hear more and more about cap and trade. Right.
It can exist, at a variety of levels. In Europe, there is a European-wide system that's been put in place, but individual governments, individual countries put in place their own systems within that broader European Union structure. And in the U.S., because we've not had national legislation, there's a group of northeastern states that have actually gone forward. So we actually do have a small, cap and trade system that covers the northeastern states. And meanwhile, California is working on a similar system. So you can do it at various different levels. I know there's even been discussion about allowing these state level systems in the U.S. to perhaps have some trading with the European system. I mean, ideally, you would do all of this at a global on a global basis, and ideally, you would include not just industrial countries but developing countries as well. It's going to be certainly some time before we get to that kind of a global system, and I think meanwhile we'll see continuing progress in developing things at both the national and subnational level.
In terms of this cap and trade system, this idea of pollution permits and trading and so on, it has flaws when it's something, let's say, like smog. If you have a smog, this kind of system in smog, you may be allowing a company to do damage in one particular area by buying the rights to do that, by buying something from a cleaner company somewhere else. And so where the effects are localized, these kinds of emissions trading things have their flaws, it seems to me. But with global warming and greenhouse gas emission, it seems to me there is no downside like that. Do you agree?
Yes, and that's the reason, of course, it was applied to this issue, is that doesn't really matter where the carbon dioxide is released. It all has a effect globally, and so it literally does not matter. Whereas with some of the local pollutants, including sulfur dioxide, which is really where the whole cap and trade system was originally used, was to deal with the sulfur dioxide that leads to acid rain and other environmental damages. There were plenty of arguments that didn't make that much sense, because you were not necessarily reducing emissions in the location where they needed to be reduced, but the counter argument that it would be so much more economically efficient, won out even in that case. I think with the climate problem, the more relevant debate is, do we do carbon cap and trade, or do we do something like a carbon tax, which many economists argue really would be more efficient, would be a lot simpler and easier to implement, probably fewer political complications. On the other hand, there is tremendous support for the carbon cap and trade approach among industries, and that is, appears to be the direction that most, though not all, countries are headed in.
And what is, you said that the Northeast has already done it, California is working on it. What is the position of the Obama administration in terms of, let's say, in terms of both of those, cap and trade versus carbon taxes?
During the campaign, Senator Obama was a strong supporter of cap and trade, as were, by the way, virtually all of the Democratic candidates and John McCain as well. And that's not surprising. I mean, that's what the Congress was working on, though was not able to successfully pass a bill last summer. But you're starting to hear quite a number of voices that argue that this issue should at least not be closed at this point. That a carbon tax should be considered, including people like Jim Hansen and Al Gore, and indeed even Larry Summers, who's going to be one of the top economic officials in the White House. Like most economists, Summers has argued that a carbon tax would really be a more efficient way to do this.
And let's pursue that just for a moment more. In other words, what we were talking about before, which is that we have had it set up so there was no cost to a company for putting greenhouse gases into the air. And so a carbon tax, it seems to me, very simply begins to include the costs of fossil fuels in the price of fossil fuels. And might we end up with some sort of combination, or is that the one that the industries will fight and they'll settle for cap and trade? And if so, even why is cap and trade more palatable to them?
Well, that's a good question. I think that there's sort of a tendency to not like anything that's called a tax, and I think there's a lot of firms and even individuals assume that they would be able to, largely avoid the cost of cap and trade. That there's one big question is whether you would require that the these emission allowances be auctioned or whether they would simply be given for free. If you want to have a big impact, you absolutely need to auction them so that there's a significant price. But we know that what's happened in Europe is that certain industries, like the steel industry, that feel that they will be negatively affected, have been successful in persuading policymakers to simply give them the allowances. And in fact, some companies have profited enormously from this system, essentially without doing anything, without making any investment. So it is, I think, politically a very, very complex issue, and I personally think that the case for a carbon dioxide tax is pretty compelling. And if you were able to effectively, educate the public and even business in a way that probably only a president would be able to effectively do, this reaction that most people have right now that a carbon dioxide tax is simply not politically realistic.
That great phrase
that potentially could be changed.
That great phrase that you hear about universal single-payer health care as well, that we lack the political will, right? Which just means that the industries that would be affected have enough money to tell us we lack the political will. Now, a point in that one, by the way, is that you can make such carbon taxes neutral, revenue neutral, right? In other words, we could reduce income taxes to the same amount that we add these carbon taxes, and you could then say to the largest numbers of people in the country, your income tax will go down. So the thing that we want you to do, which is to work and labor and produce goods, will be taxed less, and it will be up to you to use less carbon. Buy a more energy efficient car, buy a more energy efficient appliance, begin to monitor your usage, and it will give you some control over that tax, whereas you don't want to have to control how much you work.
Exactly, and I think that being able to effectively make the case that you just made, it would be the key to the political feasibility of a carbon tax. I think you would need to rebate, virtually all of it directly to taxpayers, so that they literally felt that it was coming out of one pocket but going back into another. If you basically use this as a way of giving Congress the ability to spend more money, I think there's just no way that our political system is going to let it go forward. But it seems to me that is a system that would make an awful lot of sense. We potentially could get, according to one proposal, a dramatic reduction in our payroll taxes.
Right.
We could basically use our energy system to help fund our retirement.
Yeah, I like that idea, that we use the price of fossil fuels to help us as we become fossils ourselves. You've got a minute, basically a minute. What would be the final thing you'd say to listeners where they can learn more, where they can take action, what you'd encourage people to do if this year is so crucial?
Well, this is the year to be politically engaged and to urge, your member of Congress and to urge the administration to develop strong national legislation, but also to put the U.S. In a leadership position in working internationally with our allies around the world to forge a strong agreement in Copenhagen next year. The U.S. has been basically out of this game, both domestically and in terms of our international negotiations. Even in his press conference, final press conference yesterday, George Bush conceded that one of the reasons he was so unpopular in the world was the fact that he had rejected Kyoto. We now have an opportunity to reclaim some of that lost ground and really be a leader in solving the problem, just as we've been a leader in creating it. Okay, the one question I didn't get to was how does the current global financial crisis affect all this, but we will leave that for another day. You got another hour?
Exactly. So again, the book is State of the World 2009. The website is worldwatch.org. It is a phenomenal site for information on this and everything else, and I suggest go and look there and see if you can find those 10, are the 10 crises on the website or only in the book, the 10 challenges?
I believe that they're only in the book.
Okay.
But you'll find a lot of other great material.
Right. Again, worldwatch.org. Thank you, Chris FLAVIN. Keep up the good work.